In this video, I am going to show you the complete build process start to finish of this solid Black Limba Cajon with an adjustable snare. Started off with some beautiful Black Limba, went ahead and book matched that to get it that nice river look down the center of the grain, and started off by routing a groove on each of the sides for the top and bottom just to have additional surface space for gluing those sides onto the tops and bottoms. As you can see, I had my router bit set just a hair deeper than it needed to be, so I did have to clean this up with the chisel a very small amount. So again, repeated those steps on both sides of the top and bottom, and then use some 80 grit sandpaper that I have attached to a piece of plywood to clean that up, making sure that all of the pieces fit together, and then added some bracing for those corner joints to just give them a little bit of additional space to connect and get glued up. Got those clamped down, cleaned up the squeeze out, and went ahead and continued that process with bracing around each of the corners as well as the top and bottom. Again, just giving a nice reinforcement around each of the joints and some additional space to get those glued up, as well as some cross bracing to prevent any cracking or splitting of the wood if the instrument was dropped. So on the sides, I did a very thin strip for the side bracing. I did both some wood glue as well as some CA glue just to get that clamped down. And closing up the box now. Most of this is pretty much rinse and repeat at this point. And then started to finally get this box closed up. I did have to do this in a couple different attempts because I didn't have enough clamps to clamp the entire box together that were long enough. So I did leave the top unglued, got it clamped up, and then um, did that on a second attempt. And then took some clamp calls on the bottom here, and that was allowed me to use additional shorter clamps to get that. So I did have enough. Mark the back and trim that up on the bandsaw. And then started to mark where I wanted the sound hole and get that measured out. So I can move over and get that sound hole cut out. And got it cleaned up on the spindle sander, and then moved over to a roundover bit with the router. Did the front and back to get that to have a nice smooth roundover feeling to it. Cleaned it up by hand with some sandpaper. Then marking off where I wanted the cross bracing there. Repeated the same steps with the wood glue and CA glue just to make sure that it was in place, because that is a bit of a tricky place to clamp on these thin pieces of wood. Did some cross bracing. You can see with the grain going the opposite direction as you would with an acoustic guitar back. And finally getting this box closed up, putting the back on here, getting that all nice and glued up. Plenty of tape to make sure that was held in place. And then moving over to some clamps with it. And then cleaning that up a little bit on the belt sander, also with a hand plane, just to remove some of that squeeze out. And did have a couple little small gaps in just a few different places around the seams there. So added some glue on there and wiped off the excess. And then went over top of that with the orbital sander to kind of smooth that out. This actually turned out really nice. You can't even really tell that there was any bit of a gap there. Super happy with how that turned out. So nice little trick to fill in a small gap, and off to cutting the snare in half. So this was just a snare wire set that I picked up on Amazon for a couple dollars. They are significantly harder to get cut than it looks. You can only cut one or two wires at a time, and then round it over all of the edges, again with a round over bit. And I like to use a strip of masking tape along where the router bit is going to kind of ride against that wood just to prevent any types of marks on it. And then just smooth that off real quick with the orbital sander. And at this point, I am covering up the couple small wormholes that are in the one piece of wood and going to fill those in with some black CA glue. You could also do this with epoxy or something along those lines. The black CA glue comes out really nice on this type of wood. And then went over to cutting out the star knobs for the adjustable snare. So I wanted to do one for actually adjusting the snare tension, and then one on the other side to tighten that down. I could have went and bought star knobs, cheap plastic ones, but I wanted to have something that matched the rest of the instrument. Um, I did my best attempt to get even placement to drill these holes. As you can see, I had to adjust that a little bit. Got those drilled out, and then a center hole for where the dowel rod will connect. Then moved over and cut the rest of the material away. Got those cleaned up on the sander there. Continued that process for each of them, as well as these little donut shapes that I will actually use on the inside of the dowel rod to lock those in place, prevent those from sliding, as well as being able to prevent that from getting pulled out. Marked off where I wanted those, went ahead and drilled a hole. I did start this on the outside and go on the inside. Just wanted to make sure I didn't have any tear out. Put that through, marked off where the length of the dowel rod, clean that up a bit, and realized that my sander was off a little bit on the angle, so I had to adjust that, get it nice and flat so it would sit on the inside of the side there. Got that little donut marked off and glued up. And again, that one will keep the dowel rod in place so it doesn't slide around. Then attach the dowel rod to the star knob. And as that's drying, I got the outside cleaned up and used a two-part epoxy for pore fill, using a plastic razor blade to spread that around, which those are nice and cheap, and I can just throw them away after I use them. I did have to warm up the epoxy a bit because the workshop was quite cold when I did this pore fill. Repeated those steps all the way around, and already looking really good with that Black Limba. Sanded that epoxy down all the way to the wood again. You can see there's some spots that have a bit of a reflection, so needed a little more sanding. And did that all the way around, got it nice and leveled down. And then after that, moved over to doing a single coat of True Oil on the inside just to slow any changes in humidity. And then did several very thin coats of True Oil on the outside, buffing those down best that I can. And in between each of the coats, I use a triple aught steel wool to buff those out. Then marking the placement for the threaded insert that I'm going to put in the dowel rod, which will allow me to tighten that down as I adjust the tension of the snare. Getting that insert in there and made sure that it threads in straight. And then continuing on making the rest of these pieces here. So on this one, I'm actually planning to insert the bolt for tightening it down inside the star knob, which you'll see here. Takes quite a bit of work to get that chiseled out by hand. If anybody has a better way of doing this, feel free to share because this was quite a bit of time to actually chisel down to get that bolt to fit in there nice and secure. Got that cleaned up and the excess material cut off. Cleaned it up on the sander again and making a piece to cover that up. So marking that off, and that's actually going to go over top of the bolt so you can't see it. And again, using triple aught steel wool to buff it out. I tend to buff it out and use the shop vac, kind of clean it up a little bit. Sometimes I'll use paper towel and naphtha to wipe it down after that steel wool. And putting in some paste wax to help the dowel rod um, move freely as it's in there. And inserting another one of those little rings on the other side, and that's going to keep the dowel rod and the snare adjustment from sliding out. If it were to be totally unscrewed on the other side. And then I glue that bolt in place, covering it up with another piece of Limba, trying to match the grain best that I can, and then marking off where I'm going to attach the snares to the dowel rod. Go ahead and drill those holes for it. Get those tightened up and attached. And I will say that I jabbed myself with the screwdriver, slipping on that dowel rod, but didn't get it on tape. And here I'm marking off where I want to actually prevent the snare from moving any further. So a little locking mechanism just with the screw on the top and bottom. So that will prevent the snare from moving too far forward as well as too far back away from the front of the cajon. Cleaned up the star knobs quite a bit and then got some True Oil on those. And then moved on to attaching some anti-skid pads on the bottom. And then gluing a washer here and put a second washer in between to provide a little bit of spin, friction-free space there. Getting the front sanded down a little bit and the front plywood piece marked off and cut to size. And then sanded quite a bit. I realized I could have done this before doing any of the True Oil on the outside. I wanted to make sure that I had a number of layers of True Oil on the outside before I added the adjustable snare in there. So that was the reasoning for waiting to do the finish until afterwards, measuring off and drilling the holes for the screws on the front. And after drilling those on the face of the cajon, got it taped down to the box itself, drilled out those holes on the side bracing, got it cleaned up a little bit with some naphtha, and then glued it down and tightened those screws down to get it in place. And then filling the side gaps with a little bit of glue and taping those down, making sure that I got it cleaned up, any excess squeeze out. Sanding that down a little bit, and now I am applying some true oil onto the front, as well as that side area where I sanded down a little bit, and a final look at it right before we hear what it sounds like. Without a snare, and with a snare.